What if everything you thought you knew about white people, their origins, their meaning, their place in history, was turning out to be wrong? What if whiteness isn't a heritage, but a migration, a survival story, a climate adaptation, a narrative we built long after the facts? Today, we go beyond the myths, beyond the assumptions, and dive into the real science, the ancient texts, the hidden migration routes. Where did humanity's lighter-skinned peoples actually come from, and why does it matter? Our story begins not in Europe, but in Africa, that great continent of cradle and hearth. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors walked the plains of East Africa, hunted, gathered, adapted to equatorial sun and open land. Genetic, fossil, and archaeological evidence agree. All modern humans trace their deepest ancestry to Africa. Picture groups of dark-skinned humans whose skin was rich with melanin, a natural protector against intense ultraviolet radiation near the equator. Dark skin was not a mark of shame, but a mark of deep adaptation, a survival trait in a world of open skies and blazing sun. From this African root, humanity would spread. Over tens of thousands of years, some groups would move northwards into unfamiliar climates and latitudes, carrying their heritage but meeting new challenges. In the pages of the ancient text, we find one of humanity's oldest stories, the Great Flood. According to the book of Genesis, chapter 9, only one family and their animals survived the deluge: the man Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In many traditional readings, Shem is linked to Semitic peoples, Middle East, and Ham to Africa and some Near East civilizations, and Japheth to the more northern lands. Whether one places literal historic fact in this text or sees it as a mythic structure, the key idea is dispersion, a people moving out, adapting to new lands, encountering new challenges and climates. In our story, we follow Japheth northwards, from the highlands of the Near East to the colder, lighter sun regions of Europe and the forested north. This is a migration of exposure, from intense UV to diminished UV, from open equatorial landscapes to tundra, trees, winter. Imagine a group of people, once accustomed to intense equatorial sun, moving into lands where the sun is weaker. The winters are longer, the daylight shorter. The challenge of survival changes. Among the many pressures on biology, diet, shelter, pathogens, one key factor stands out: the role of ultraviolet radiation in skin, the need for vitamin D, and protection of folate. Scientific studies show that skin color is highly correlated with latitude and UV radiation intensity. Melanin, the pigment in skin, both protects against UV damage and slows vitamin D production at low UV latitudes. The balance shifts. Genes such as SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and MCR1 affect melanin production. For example, the mutation at SLC24A5, RS1426654, is nearly fixed in European populations and accounts for a significant portion of skin tone difference between Europeans and West Africans. So the story becomes this. Humans of darker skin arrive in regions where the sun is weaker. The protective melanin that served them well near the equator begins to be a handicap for vitamin D production. Over generations, populations with lighter skin endure less vitamin D deficiency, less rickets, better health. Natural selection and drift shape skin tone lighter. This is not about superiority, but about survival in a new environment.
Thus, whiteness starts to emerge not from divine decree or mythic superiority, but from deep time migration, new latitude, adaptation to climate. Skin color becomes a regional trait, not a marker of value. But the story of migration and adaptation is only part of the journey. Culture, knowledge, power, and memory also play key roles. As northern groups, traditionally associated with the descendants of Japheth, settled into Europe's forests, plains, and coasts, the great civilizations of the South, Africa, Near East, the Mediterranean, were already flourishing. The mighty civilizations of the Kush and the ancient Egypt, the trading sea peoples of the Phoenicians, and the early Dravidian peoples of India had long developed writing, architecture, agriculture, and astronomy. Yet over centuries, as Northern Europe grew into its own, there emerged a narrative shift. The idea of civilized became bound with white. In the 18th century, the German naturalist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach classified humanity into 5 races: Caucasian, Mongoloid, Malayan, Ethiopian, American, and placed Caucasians, light-skinned Europeans, at the top. This was not neutral science, it was ideology, dressed in scientific garb, used to justify colonization, slavery, and exclusion. This historic turn matters. Skin color ceased to be only a biological adaptation and became a social symbol, a tool of power, an identity marker. Societies rewrote texts, erased darker-skinned rulers, repainted histories, created myths of white superiority. In reality, the knowledge and roots of civilization were born in the South and transferred northward by trade, migration, conquest, and often forgotten. We pause for a moment. What is race? What is white? These are not simple biological categories. They are constructed identities. The idea that humans can be divided into fixed races based on skin color is a modern invention, less than 3 centuries old. Many scholars now regard race as a social construct, not a biological reality. When Blumenbach labeled Caucasians, he was already linking a skin tone to a perceived culture, morality, geography. Whiteness became idealized, blackness marginalized. What started as adaptation became hierarchy. Yet the genes tell a different story. They show us how skin tone is fluid, how populations interbreed and migrate, how far more separates humans than divides them. Light-skinned Aboriginal Australians, albino Africans with African features but pale skin, the diversity within any race, all point to the fact that appearance is superficial. Ancestry runs deeper. Genetic studies show convergent evolution of light skin in Eurasians. Light skin traits arose independently in Europe and East Asia. As one review puts it, skin color variation is one of the most striking examples of human phenotypic diversity. Dominated by melanin, populations closer to the equator tend to have dark skin, Lighter skin in populations at higher latitudes is an underlying selection to maintain vitamin D photosynthesis. So whiteness was never destiny. It is region. It is adaptation. And when framed as superiority, it became myth. Let's turn back to the text, the book of Genesis and its account of Noah's sons. Many have read these passages to support racial narratives. But even within Scripture, the symbolism of skin color is far more complex. In the book of Exodus, the story of Moses placing his hand in his cloak, withdrawing it white as snow, this was a sign of affliction or illness, not reward. The sister of Moses, Miriam, displeased the Lord, and her skin turned leprous, white as snow, and she was shut out from the camp until healed. The servant Gehazi, lying to his master Elisha, bore a skin disease. His flesh turned white as snow. These are not positive metaphors for whiteness. They are metaphors of disease, imbalance, alienation. A deeper reading suggests that in ancient symbolism, whiteness did not signify superiority, but sometimes punishment, otherness.
If one reads the narrative of Noah's 3 sons allegorically, one sees a story of dispersion, differentiation, and blessing, but not predetermined racial hierarchies. Shem, Ham, and Japheth become ancestors of many nations, but the text does not tie morality to skin color. Modern readings that overlay racial categories onto these names, therefore, must tread carefully. Thus, when we hear from Ham came black people, from Japheth came white people, we must pause. The text offers neither pigment charts nor race science. It offers a story of human origins, family, migration, and covenant. But when we couple it with modern science, we gain a richer understanding. All human beings share a common origin. Pigmentation differences emerged later. Narratives of superiority were added much later still. Zoom out now into the molecular world. What changed in our skin as our ancestors moved north? What mutations? What adaptations? Key genes we recognize today include SLC24A5 and SLC45A2. The derived allele of SLC24A5, for example, is nearly fixed in Europeans and largely absent in African populations, indicating strong selection. Another, MC1, influences the switch from eumelanin, dark pigment, to pheomelanin, lighter pigment. One comprehensive review of skin pigmentation adaptation notes that depigmentation has, to some degree, evolved independently in Europeans and East Asians. So light skin did not arise once, but multiple times, under similar selective pressures. The driver? UV radiation's dual role, protecting folate, vitamin B9, which is essential for fetal development and DNA repair, and enabling vitamin D synthesis, which in low UV environments becomes critical. Dark skin helps when UV is intense. Lighter skin helps when it is weak.
In this story, lighter skin is not better. It is a regional adaptation, a biological response to less sun, colder climate, different diet, for example, reduced fish or vitamin D-rich foods, insulation, and daylight hours. And this adaptation likely occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Some studies suggest that the light-skin variants in Europe arose only in the last 8,000 to 10,000 years after agriculture and population shifts. At the same time, other populations in high-latitude but vitamin D-rich diet environments, like the Inuit, retained relatively darker skin because their diet compensated, showing adaptation is not always straightforward.
So, what does this all mean for the modern listener, for the viewers who have grown up with textbooks, assumptions of thought around race? It means that the narrative of us versus them dissolves under the glare of science and history. We all descend from Africa. We all carry the legacy of migration, adaptation, and change. Light skin emerges when humans moved into cold, low UV lands and adapted. Dark skin emerges where sun is high. Neither is inherently better. The genetic variations are modest, largely superficial in light of the unity beneath our skin. Modern genetics confirms that the greatest chunk of human genetic diversity lies within African populations. Populations that left Africa carried only subsets of that diversity. Thus, black or white are poor proxies for meaning or ancestry. When we revisit ancient texts, Noah, his sons, the spread of peoples across continents, we can read them not as endorsing racial hierarchies, but as recognizing dispersion, difference, change. When we place those stories alongside genetic science, migration archaeology, climate adaptation, a new story opens, a story not of separation, but of divergence and reconnection, not of fixed identities, but of movement, change, adaptation. In this new light, white people are not a fixed race, but a historical result, northern adaptation of the same human story. And white, as a category, becomes less about biology, more about history, geography, culture, power. Why does this matter now? Because the way we think about race affects how we live. When we understand that skin color is adaptation, not destiny, we open doors to empathy. We recognize that the other is not foreign, the roots are shared. When we teach children about identity, origin, and history, we can shift from narratives of division to narratives of connection. We can separate biology from ideology. Yes, human beings look different in color. Yes, survival and migration shape those differences, but skin color does not equate to value. When we build societies, acknowledge power, correct historical erasures, we can also reclaim the stories of those who contributed to civilization, the African mathematicians, architects, astronomers, the Phoenicians who brought writing, the Moors who preserved knowledge when Europe slept. History becomes more colorful and inclusive. And today, when we look at the spectrum of humanity, from darkest to lightest skin, we see not separate species, but one lineage adapting to many lands, climates, diets, lifestyles. The invention of whiteness as superior is a myth we can dismantle with science, with history, with compassion. In this journey, from Africa's warm plains to the snow-kissed forests of Northern Europe, From the flood myth of Noah to the genome of SLC24A5, from ancient civilizations of the South to the colonial myths of the modern era, we have walked through the origin of what we mean by white people. What have we learned? That humanity began in Africa, that skin color is adaptation, that migration and environment shaped traits, that the social meaning of whiteness was constructed later, that all of us share a common story, and the differences we see are not signs of separate destinies, but variation in one single human family. Let this story not separate us further, but draw us closer. Let it open classrooms, churches, homes, to a deeper conversation about identity, one rooted in the soil of shared origin, the sky of shared adaptation, and the unfolding story of one species striving, adapting, surviving together. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the real story of us all. If you found this journey eye-opening, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for our next exploration. And I invite you, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because our differences tell a story, but they don't divide us.